going to start my discussion of today's book by simply saying, I think everyone who writes science fiction or fantasy should read this book. They should set aside a whole week to read it and to think about it and reflect on it and figure out how to make use of it and how all the thoughts that it inspires can fuel their work. Because this book, I think, has more to say about the way science fiction and fantasy could work while at the same time being about a slightly different topic than almost anything else I have ever read. The book is called But What If We're Wrong? By Chuck Klosterman. You might know him. He's written for a number of magazines like GQ, and he has also produced a number of other book-length discussions of popular culture, which was how I came across him in the first place. And the best way to think about what this book is about is by looking at the subtitle, Thinking About the Present as If It Were the Past. And when I first encountered this book, and it was January 22nd, 2017. I remember the exact day. I was in a Barnes & Noble that's not far from my house, and I bumped into the book more or less at random. And I took it off the shelf and ended up reading about half of it just standing up in the bookstore. And that convinced me the best thing to do would be give the nice bookstore owner my money, go home, and read the whole thing properly. The reason I know what the exact day was is because I still have the receipt. It was tucked into the book. I've reread the book a few times since, and every time I read it, I get a little bit more from it. And it plays out in something of the same way that a previous book that I've talked about does, the book in question being Why Does the World Exist by Jim Holt? Because it's not about finding a definitive answer to the questions that it brings up. It's about the quest for such an answer, what a quest for finding an answer looks like, and how it could be approached, all the different ways that we could unpack the idea that it treats. So the core conceit of the book, again, is reflected in this subtitle, Thinking About the Present as If It Were the Past. How much of what we think we can say about the future is going to be wrong in ways that we can't even possibly imagine? How much of what we know, or what we think we know about the here and now, about our history, about many things, how much of all of that is just an artifact of our moment in time? How much of it is not durable? How many of the things do we take for granted are slipping away from us as we speak in ways that we can't even perceive? I'm not just talking about things like the glaciers melting away from us, but our ideas about ourselves, our whole ways of living. And the way he treats this is through discussions of popular culture and a number of other subjects, but the popular culture stuff is probably going to be the most direct and accessible. And since that's Klosterman's forte, that's his entry point. For instance, one of the early chapters in the book is about who was going to be remembered as the novelist of the 21st century. And his speculation was that it might not even be somebody who's even been born yet, because we're only a quarter of the way through the century, if even that. It might also be somebody that we do know, but there's a good chance that it will be somebody that none of us know. It could be somebody who right now is completely unknown to us and who will only be understood as being the real luminary of the 21st century's letters in retrospect. And in the way he reaches this is by showing us all the ways that commercial and critical success are not necessarily reliable indicators of future esteem. Many of the great writers of the past were canonized by way of historical processes that are, in fact, quite opaque to us. And one of the good examples of this is Herman Melville. This was a guy who was almost completely ignored in his time. And his one great work that we all associate with him, Moby Dick, was a giant flop. And after he had suffered a number of such failures, he gave up writing entirely and went to work as a customs inspector for New York State. And it was only decades after he died that his work was excavated and reappreciated by academics and by book lovers who were able to make a case for future generations about what a brilliant writer he was. So all of his real luster is something that only came to him after the fact, decades after the fact, in retrospect. Who gets remembered and why? And that's a really difficult question to answer because it's often counterintuitive. It's often because of the ways we construct history, as Klosterman puts it, to explain the present. Another example he gives of this is with rock music. A lot of the popular music from the 1960s that wasn't the Beatles has been pretty much pushed off the map. And this goes by way of him talking about how he's wondering whether or not the Beatles will be remembered in 100 years, and he believes they will. But he also feels that the reason that we would believe such a thing is because such beliefs confirm our existing prejudices about what great music is. How do these prejudices get sustained and transmitted across time? And what happens when those prejudices get disrupted by social forces that we can't anticipate? And he also talks about our scientific understanding of the universe in the same way. We have these feelings that a lot of the things that we could take for granted about scientific knowledge is stuff that we can take for granted because it's more or less settled. We got it right this time, honest. Is math going to be wrong in the future? But again, that all assumes that our understanding of these things is based on math to begin with, and that paradigm shifts that take all of the ground out from under our feet are often very quiet to begin with. They're not things that necessarily begin in this really noisy, obviously disruptive fashion. They often happen in such a way that by the time they're done, we've barely noticed it. And so he skips and switches between a bunch of different pop culture aspects that he feels are good examples of what he's talking about, like the future of television, its value as a historical artifact. And this actually leads into a fun discussion of him asking the question, what is the realest fake thing that we have ever made on purpose? And his vote is for the TV show Roseanne, which I thought was kind of surprising because he actually makes a very good case for it. He also goes into things like the way sports have shifted tremendously in terms of the way that we appreciate them in popular culture. We're getting to a point now where things like boxing and football are starting to become regarded with increasing suspicion and skepticism as far as the harm that they do to their very players. Do we really want to be encouraging this? Is a world without contact sports truly unimaginable? And sure, it would be a totally different world, but as he puts it, totally different worlds are being created all the time, right under our noses. There's much more to the book in terms of all the different discussions that he brings up. I've only given a sample of a few of them and what their flavors are like. And I think the big point is not that any of this is to be agreed with 100%, but to give you an idea of how thought experiments of these kinds can be conducted and what perspective to take on them, to give you an idea of how to think counterintuitively about the here and now. And that leads us into science fiction and fantasy, because those are tools for creating counterintuition in their audience. Science fiction is typically about the future or about, some variation on the present. And even when it's about the future, it's really about the present in what I would describe as a weirdened sort of way, as a distanced sort of way. We're looking at what's around us right now through the lens of a possible future. And as modern life becomes more and more like science fiction in a lot of ways, and not in a good way, and more frustrating and dystopian and frightening, how can we imagine futures that are not just hyper extensions of what we have now? And that's a really tough assignment. It's an order of magnitude harder to think about the future in a way that we have not thought about the future before. It's hard to get out of the habits of thinking about the future in the same way. It's tougher to do that. It's probably also a whole lot less commercially appealing. But at the same time, it's also that much more rewarding and daring to make those kinds of experiments. There's a phrase that he used to encapsulate all this thinking. The phrase is, we want new tomorrows, but only if they're like yesterday. And fantastic fiction, whatever form it takes, whether fantasy or science fiction, helps us see that much more clearly tomorrow can't be like yesterday or today, and that yesterday is not the way that we really imagined it, that our ideas about yesterday are just that, ideas. Ways to try and make all these things, our projections about the future, conform to our expectations are going to be deceptive and frustrating. And that's not just limited to the cliche of the old man yelling at a cloud. We're all doing this. Even the most progressive-minded of us are doing this. All of us have an anchor in the here and now, a stake in the here and now. And we can't just throw that anchor overboard, but we may have some ideas through SF and fantasy about how things can change to make that effort less strenuous, how we can think about the future as if it were the past a little more freely, a little more open-endedly. I got to thinking about how much science fiction is either an attempt to predict the future or is a prediction of the future. And one of the things that came most immediately to mind was Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, where the prediction of the future is actually a plot element. And a lot of fantasy is about the unstated expectation that in the universe that it takes place in, things are going to stay pretty much the same for uncountable lengths of time. There isn't going to be a transition from a pre-modern worldview to a modern worldview. That's out of the picture. But again, both of those kinds of things are assumptions. They're assumptions about our thinking about the past and the present and the future. And those assumptions deserve to be questioned. And if we can question them in the very stories that are using them, then it's going to give us that much more freedom to tell stories that give our audiences that much more perspective. We deserve to think as freely as we can about our moment. We deserve to understand why all we have is just provisional in the moment. And that doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. It means that it's fragile, and it means it's fragile in ways we don't perceive. It also means that it's too easy for us to lull ourselves into a sense of complacency about how we got to take our ideas about the past and the present and the future for granted. So going against all of that is going to be good for all of us, especially if you're making it your business to write fantastic fiction, because such things have at their heart questions about everything. So you can tell from the way that I've been talking about the book what kind of inspiration it gave me. And once again, the book is But What If We're Wrong by Chuck Klosterman, available both print and digitally. And again, anybody in the business of writing fantastic fiction deserves to sit down with it for a little bit and see what kinds of thoughts it stimulates for them. I guarantee you won't come out of it thinking the same way about at least one thing. See you soon.